Welcome to part 1 of Project 250, the prequels. As you probably know, our weekly journey through the past doesn't begin until January. In the meantime, we thought it might be a good idea to provide some context with a very brief tutorial on the events preceding the revolution. Please keep in mind that this is by no means intended to be a graduate-level seminar on the origins of the American Revolution, but rather a brief rundown of stuff you probably learned in high school, but may have forgotten. So without further ado, let's begin. It hardly needs explanation that the causes of the American Revolution were extremely complex and encompassed various cultural, social, and economic factors. Still, at its core, the revolution was an ideological struggle over the rights of Englishmen and the colonists' refusal to accept a subordinate status, and hence subordinate rights, within the British Empire. As Englishmen living in America, the colonists believed they possessed the same rights as those living in England, including the right to representation. From the American perspective, the bottom line was that Great Britain could not impose direct taxes on the colonists without colonial representation. The British, for their part, argued that while the colonists were not directly represented in Parliament, they did enjoy virtual representation, since Parliament legislated for the benefit of the whole empire, including the colonies. The Americans completely rejected this argument. The colonists' arguments were based on an ancient tradition of constitutional liberty and restraint of royal power that traced back to at least 1215 and the Magna Carta, and perhaps even further back than that. Moreover, the influence of Enlightenment thinkers, such as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, who wrote about the social contract and consent of the governed, also played a significant role in shaping American political thought. Locke, in particular, established the concept of the natural rights of life, liberty, and property, which Locke argued were the common heritage of all mankind. Furthermore, kings and princes could be overthrown and replaced if they failed to safeguard these rights. When the English came to North America, they brought with them all of these concepts of Magna Carta, limited monarchy, and personal liberty. Moreover, these concepts were codified into the foundational documents of individual colonies, such as the Mayflower Compact and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, to name two examples. Furthermore, Great Britain, badly distracted by turmoil at home, specifically the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, was slow to establish the bureaucratic infrastructure needed to govern its colonies effectively. In a more practical sense, these problems were compounded by the distances involved. The colonies were simply too far away to allow for close scrutiny by British officials. Finally, beginning around 1721, Prime Minister Robert Walpole, in an effort to stimulate commercial activity, adopted an unofficial policy known as salutary neglect, which called for lax enforcement of the navigation acts that regulated trade between Britain and the colonies. Making a long story short, the end result of all this was that by the mid-1700s, the American colonists had grown accustomed to a fairly high degree of self-determination, running their own affairs without British interference and largely ignoring British regulations. So what went wrong? The impetus for change came with the French and Indian War of 1756 to 1763. The war, while a great British victory, brought to the surface many of the underlying tensions within the colonial relationship. British officials, disdainful of what they considered American military ineptitude, were angry that the colonists had made so few financial contributions to the war effort. Moreover, they were particularly bitter that some colonial merchants had traded with the French enemy. But more than any other single factor, it was England's crushing war debt that would drive future events. By 1763, England's debt stood between £129 and £137 million, an astonishing amount for the time. To put this into perspective, the annual interest on this debt was about £5 million at a time when Britain's entire annual budget was only £8 million. It's no surprise that there were genuine fears of the empire going bankrupt. Together, all of these factors, but particularly the war debt, convinced British leaders that a major reorganization of the empire, giving London more control, was in order. The man tasked with implementing this policy was the new Prime Minister, George Grenville. Grenville's program was designed to increase revenue from the colonies while easing the heavy tax burden on British landlords and merchants. The question was, how could these goals be accomplished? Grenville's solution was to implement a series of new revenue acts, including the new Sugar Act and Currency Act, as well as the Quartering or Mutiny Act, which required colonial legislatures to provide housing and provisions for British troops but also included enhanced anti-smuggling measures, such as increased ship patrols, open-ended search warrants called writs of assistance, strengthening customs enforcement and trial without jury for accused smugglers. But the most hated, and most fiercely resisted, of the new measures was the Stamp Act. Passed in March 1765, the Stamp Act levied an internal revenue tax in the form of stamps that had to be purchased and affixed to specified documents and publications, including licenses, newspapers, marriage licenses, birth certificates, and government documents. While all the Grenville Acts were resisted, attention centered on the Stamp Act because it affected the most people. Given the ubiquitous nature of paper documents in the 18th century, avoiding the tax was almost impossible. On May 29, 1765, in Williamsburg, the Virginia House of Burgesses, at the urging of Patrick Henry, recently elected to represent Louisa County, passed the Virginia Resolves, which condemned the stamp tax as a violation of their right to be taxed only with the consent of the colonial legislatures. Later that year, in October 1765, the Stamp Act Congress met in New York City. Attended by delegates from 9 colonies, it firmly denied Parliament's right to tax the colonists. While initially peaceful, the resistance movement soon turned violent. Sometime during 1765, the Sons of Liberty were organized in New York and Boston. Using physical threats, tarring and feathering, burning tax stamps, and other forms of intimidation, they severely impeded efforts to enforce the stamp tax and, in many instances, forced collectors to resign. In addition, a series of non-importation agreements were instituted, effectively boycotting British goods. On July 10, 1765, George Grenville was dismissed as Prime Minister and replaced by Charles Watson Wentworth, the Marquess of Rockingham, who took a much more conciliatory approach. On March 18, 1766, the Stamp Act was finally withdrawn. Parliament, faced with the choice of sending an army to enforce the Stamp Act or repealing it, chose the latter. Even so, they immediately followed up with the Declaratory Act of March 1766, which vigorously reaffirmed Parliament's authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. On July 30, 1766, King George III dismissed the Rockingham government, which he regarded as too conciliatory, and called upon the aging William Pitt, now Lord Chatham, to form a government. However, due to Pitt's poor health, he suffered from gout and mental illness. Actual leadership fell to Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. That concludes Part 1 of Project 250, the prequels. Thank you for watching. Please join us next week for Part 2.